Dozens of cultures across the globe have some kind of myth about dragons. But are they real? I mean, with all these myths and legends, there has to be some kind of truth there, right? Today, we're looking at dragons and trying to figure out, is it even possible for these kinds of monsters to exist? Every culture has their own unique kind of dragon, but what we're going to be talking about today is the classic fire-breathing, four-legged winged dragon, the European dragon. This is the one that my D&D players out there are going to be the most familiar with. But before we can say if these things actually exist, let's take a look at some animals that we know for sure exist. First, the most obvious one, the Komodo dragon. Now, these definitely don't fly, but they are probably the closest that we have to a real dragon. Komodo dragons can get up to 10 feet long and weigh up to 300 pounds. It used to be believed that their bite was deadly due to bacteria in their mouths, but now we know that the real power comes from their venom. The last real dragon that I want to talk about today is the blue dragon sea slug. Now, I know you're asking how a sea slug is a dragon, and the answer is, well, I'm not really sure why they called it that. But dragon is in the name, and it has an interesting survival skill that I think is important for us to talk about today. But before we get into that, make sure you give the video a like. It really helps small creators like me. Thanks. Okay, so what weird survival technique do these inch-long sea slugs have? Well, they actually eat one of the most infamous jellyfish in the world and use their venom. That's right, these things prey on Portuguese man-of-war and then store their stinging cells for later use to defend themselves. There is one more creature I want to talk about, and it isn't technically a dragon, but I think that it is relevant to the conversation. The bombardier beetle. These weird little beetles have another really unique defense mechanism. See, it has two internal reservoirs that it fills with chemicals. When it's threatened, it can empty these reservoirs into a small mixing chamber where pressure builds, then it's released towards the attacker. This chemical mix causes a very exothermic reaction, so the liquid that comes out is boiling hot, smells bad, and is acidic. Kind of like dragon breath. Okay, so now that we've talked about some animals that we know for sure are real, let's talk more about mythical dragons and some of the problems that they would face. First of all, the size. If you saw my recent video about big animals, then you already know about the square cube law, but let's talk about it real quick for those who haven't. Basically, the problem with big animals is that strength goes up with the square of the size increase, while weight goes up with the cube of the size increase. To put it more simply, if a creature is twice as big, then it could potentially be 4 times stronger, but it would also be 8 times heavier. So as a creature gets bigger, it would definitely get stronger, but its weight would increase much faster. It would hit a point of diminishing returns, and eventually get to the point where gaining size would actually make it weaker and slower, because the extra weight that it's adding is too much. The biggest land animal on Earth is the elephant, and they can't even jump. So if we have an animal that's even bigger than an elephant, they would have an even harder time moving around. Dragons certainly wouldn't be the agile, powerful creatures that we see in video games and movies. The next problem that dragons would face would be the ability to fly. Now, we do have animals that fly in real life, birds, bugs, and bats. Maybe the secret to flying is having a name that starts with a B. Let's take a quick look at the biggest flightest bird, the snowy albatross. They have a wingspan maxing out at about 12 feet, and while they are very large for a bird, they certainly aren't on the same scale as a dragon. A snowy albatross with a 12-foot wingspan usually weighs around 28 pounds or so. Now, this is the part of the video where I spent way too much time on D&D websites trying to figure out exactly how much a dragon weighs, but for a full adult dragon, the absolute lowest end of this would be 6,000 to 8,000 pounds. I used that 8,000 pounds for doing some quick math and tried to figure out the wingspan of what a dragon like this would look like. And according to my math, you would need a wingspan of about 500 feet to be able to support an 8,000 pound dragon. And that's just for a smaller dragon. and assuming that its wings are as efficient as an albatross, which it probably wouldn't be. That 500-foot wingspan would also mean that maneuvering would be very slow and awkward. Just for reference, the biggest plane has a wingspan of just under 400 feet. So let's talk about planes real quick then, because that plane I just mentioned, the one that has a wingspan of 400 feet, weighs about 500,000 pounds. So how is it so much heavier than our theoretical dragon, but has smaller wings? Well, the answer is that lift is also affected by movement speed. Plane wings are small because they get going really fast before they take off, and then maintain a pretty high speed for the whole journey. So theoretically, if a dragon could run really fast, then it would be able to take off and fly with smaller wings. But the problem is still that moving wings, like those on an animal, can't really generate as much lift as static wings like you would find on a plane. So the energy expenditure is really, really big for maintaining lift and speed. That's why birds have such big pecs. Now, let's not get too bogged down in a physics lecture. The moral of the story here is that a dragon would need a wingspan of hundreds, if not thousands, of feet. But the biggest wingspan on any animal ever would have been on the Quetzalcoatlus, at about 35 feet. So there isn't even a biological precedent for an animal as large as a dragon being able to fly. The biggest animal that we know about, the blue whale, is so big and heavy that it has to live in water, so flying is a pretty far stretch. Okay, so we've already seen how size can be an issue to animals, especially a big one. But there are some things that I think would actually work. Remember the bombardier beetle we talked about earlier? Well, I think that beetle proves that fire breath might be possible. When contained and managed properly, an exothermic reaction can be weaponized by animals. And remember the blue dragon sea slug? That shows that animals can and will incorporate parts of consumed animals into their own body, such as the Portuguese man-of-war venom. Now, if you watched Discovery Channel in the early 2000s, you might know where I'm going with this, but we'll get into that in a second. Let's move on to everyone's favorite section, crafting our own theoretical, scientifically possible dragon. So, first, the most obvious thing. A real dragon wouldn't be as big as these myths and legends say. The biggest known flying animal, the Quetzalcoatlus, was estimated to be around 400 to 500 pounds. They also had adaptations that helped them maintain a low weight, such as having no tail and hollow bones, like modern birds. Now, if we want our dragon to have a tail, that means it would probably have to be smaller. And in most myths and stories and video games and movies, dragons are usually depicted with a tail. The Quetzalcoatlus had a wingspan of about 35 feet, so we could reasonably give our dragon about the same wingspan. So what would our dragon actually look like? Well, I don't think a real dragon would have 4 legs and a pair of wings. Vertebrates all have 4 limbs, and I think it would be a safe assumption that dragons would be vertebrates. I think it would be a lot more likely to see a dragon with 2 wings and 2 legs, like a bird. The amount of muscle needed for flight would be hard to support on wings coming out of a creature's back. But we've seen many examples of the 2-wing, 2-leg setup working great in real life. Alright, let's talk about diet now. I think these things would be omnivores, and probably scavengers. They could use their aerial position to scout, and then when they find a significant food source, they could land and eat. With a creature this big and energy hungry, it would need to take any meal that it could get. And speaking of size, I think it would be too big and clumsy to really chase its prey. Remember, the bigger a creature gets, the harder it is to move around. Mating and reproduction, I think, would be pretty similar to modern birds. They would need parental protection from at least one or possibly both parents. For the first few months or possibly the first few years, they would probably live in some kind of nest and keep the young safe. And a creature this large would have a hard time supporting large groups. So I think the biggest social group we would ever get would probably be 3, maybe 4. And that's only if the dragon's parents stick around for a long time, and if the mother dragon had a second child. As far as reproduction goes, I think they would lay eggs. Keeping the majority of development outside of the body helps the mother stay lighter and able to go gather food and take care of herself. Now, the fun part, fire breathing. So, the Discovery Channel special that I mentioned earlier, I think really nailed it. They suggested that a real fire breathing dragon would have to eat precious metal, mostly platinum, and get some of it on its teeth to catalyze a combustion reaction when they breathe out flammable gases. I think they would probably use a hydrogen breath mixed with platinum or palladium in their mouth to produce that fiery breath. Alternatively, they could use methane, but hydrogen is lighter, so having an internal hydrogen sac would also help keep them lighter and help them fly. The main problem here would be creating the hydrogen and obtaining the metal. Creating hydrogen actually wouldn't be that hard, though. There are a lot of creatures out there that produce hydrogen. In fact, even in humans, some of our gut bacteria can produce hydrogen. But the dragon's body would need some kind of way to filter out hydrogen from the other various gases that get produced in digestion. So I'm not really sure how a biologically based internal filtering system would work, but I think it is theoretically possible. Where the metal would come from would be a little bit harder. Platinum can be found in many parts of the world, but we usually have to mine for it, and it is pretty hard to find. I think for dragons to reliably and easily have access to platinum, they would probably need some kind of way to sense it or seek it out, or possibly just control one of the platinum areas, and when a new dragon is born, it comes to the platinum mine to munch on platinum and gain its fire breath. The other option would be trying to filter out platinum from other metals. You see, platinum is found in small quantities in a lot of areas. And when I say small quantities, I mean really, really small quantities. So a dragon would have to eat a lot of minerals and have some kind of internal processing and filtering system to be able to produce a significant enough quality of platinum to actually react with the hydrogen and ignite it. And if they were eating a lot of metals and minerals, they would probably have some way to pass the junk metals, such as gold and silver. And I think that's where the myths of dragons hoarding gold and silver comes from. The unneeded gold and silver would simply pass through the dragon's body and slowly accumulate in their favorite potty spot. Maybe that's where gold veins come from. So, our scientifically possible dragon would be a wyvern who scavenges and snacks on rocks, can breathe fire, and has a little bit of a gold hoard. Ultimately, pretty close to dragons of legend. But do I think this creature ever actually existed? Well, probably not. I do think that it is possible, especially considering all the things we talked about today, but we don't really have any hard evidence that one of these things ever existed. Most likely, the stories of dragons were just over-exaggerations of normal animals, people jazzing up their stories to try to impress each other. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. Make sure you like and subscribe and hit that little bell icon. Have a great day, and remember to stay curious.